want to tell you about a woman, let's call her Sarah, who doesn't feel like she's living a very meaningful life. Sarah's a Christian. She gets up in the morning. She tries to spend time praying, although her mind wanders and she finds it difficult. But she puts in the time, and then she heads into work. She works at Starbucks. Not very glamorous, not very interesting, and has some good friends there, but she gets frustrated that she feels like she ought to be somehow bringing them to church or sharing her faith with them or something, and it just doesn't seem to work. One of her friends, Tom, she's totally alienated because she pushed too hard and now he won't talk to her. And her friend Sandra is very close and they like working together at the coffee shop, but she just seems to have no interest. And Sarah feels not just frustrated, but feels like, what am I doing? What's the point of my life? What value does it have? Sarah goes home in the evening and watches a little bit of TV, and in advertising and TV shows and everything she seems to see on TV, she gets the same message that what really matters is changing the world, or doing something great with your life, or living up to all of your potential, which usually looks flashy and dramatic. And she looks at her life and she doesn't feel like that looks like her at all. And Sunday morning she goes to church, and what seems to matter in the sermons and the songs is bringing people to Jesus and serving the poor in dramatic ways. And people are talking again about changing the world, and she feels like that just slips through her grasp. She doesn't know how to do that. And it certainly doesn't look like the life she has. And so when Monday comes back around, she thinks, what is the meaning of my life? And then she, in her devotional reading, comes across this passage in 1 Thessalonians 4, where Paul's talking to this relatively new group of Christians in Thessalonica and trying to frame for them what a meaningful Christian life looks like. And it doesn't sound like she expects it to sound. He talks a lot about loving one another, and then he talks about living a quiet life. Well, that sounds like the opposite of what everybody around her is saying is a good life. A quiet life, not a flashy life, not even necessarily a life that changes the world, a quiet life. Talks about people working with their hands, not necessarily doing something dramatic, just ordinary manual labor. And Paul talks about working with their hands so that they won't be dependent on anyone. The point there isn't so much that there's something wrong with depending on one another, as that there were some people in Thessalonica who had become Christians, heard that Jesus was coming back, and quit their jobs and said, woohoo, let's just sit around and pray and wait. And in response to that, Paul's saying, no, you have to keep going with your daily lives. Keep on working with your hands. And this is a little bit reassuring to Sarah, but she's not quite sure what to do with it. How do we fit this together with the Gospels that are always talking about leaving everything and following Jesus, that are talking about taking up your cross? Well, it would help Sarah if we were to go back to the book of Genesis and look at the purpose of humanity when the world was first created. In Genesis 1, the animals are given a task, given a purpose, given a commission. They're told to be fruitful and multiply. And that doesn't just mean procreation. That's sort of shorthand for referring to the purpose of animals as their ordinary biological life. What animals are supposed to do is live in the world doing the things that animals normally do. They're supposed to eat and play and relate to one another and form families and reproduce. And that biological life, that ordinary animal life, God looks at and says, that is very good. And then it comes time for God to create humanity. And what's striking is that when God creates humanity, the first commission that God gives humanity is exactly the same commission that was given to the animals. Be fruitful and multiply. That doesn't mean we all have to have children. But again, it's affirming basic biological life. It's saying there's one level of God's will for human life that's a lot like God's will for animal life, which is that we be born and eat and sleep and relate to one another and marry and have sexual relationships and enjoy one another and play and live. And God looks at that dimension of human beings too and says that's very good. Now that's not the only dimension of human life. In Genesis 1, God also commissions human beings to be his image, which in context probably is talking about God's creative and life-giving activity. So God has taken a chaotic world in Genesis and ordered it enough so that life can flourish, and brought life out where there's been just death. And God seems to give humanity the task of being undergardeners, so to speak. That as God is turning this chaotic and dead creation into a garden, human beings have the task of continuing that kind of activity, doing what we can in relation to the world to help life to flourish. And where that means bringing harmony instead of chaos to do that. One of the things that involves doing for Adam is naming the animals. And so we see that one of the things God seems to value is that Adam's involved in intellectual work, in creative work. And God doesn't say, okay, I'm going to test you on what the real names of the animals are. God brings all the animals to Adam and says, okay, you decide. What do you think the names should be? Think about what the animals are like. Think about what they represent. And use your intellect and your creativity to bring some intellectual order to the world by giving them names. So the picture we get of this life that God declares as very good in the beginning of creation is a picture in which human beings are supposed to eat and sleep and play and marry and have relationships and live a pattern of life that God intended them to live in the first place. And then to go beyond that and to use their minds and to use their creativity, all for the sake of fostering life around them, but also just because this pattern of life is itself a good thing for them to do. You know, the animals don't have to do anything special in order to be very good. In order for their lives to be meaningful, they just have to be animals. And to the same extent in Genesis, human beings don't have to do anything dramatic. They just have to live well-ordered, harmonious human lives. And that pattern of life is itself a hymn to God that brings glory to God because it's part of the harmonious pattern of God's original intended creation. And so Paul is able to say, live a quiet life, work with your hands, because Paul knows that in that broad Old Testament framework, ordinary life is meaningful to God. That just like it's meaningful when animals eat and sleep and hibernate and wake up in the spring, it's meaningful when Sarah goes home and does the dishes, or when Sarah stands behind the counter at Starbucks and pours a coffee, or when Sarah sits down with her friend Sandra, who's not interested in Jesus at all, but just watches a movie with her and enjoys her company. Why? Because that's human life, and human life is in itself very good to God. Now, this doesn't sound very much like what we see in the Gospels, and that's because in one degree or another, human beings, through the biblical narrative, forget how to live a well-ordered human life. They forget parts of the pattern of life that we were created for. And so Jesus, like the prophets, like the Old Testament law, has to come back and remind people how we were intended to live and correct certain parts of our lives. And so Sarah's not wrong that her life ought to look a little bit different than Sandra's or Tom's, because Jesus is calling her to a different set of priorities. In a sense, that's what Jesus means when he calls people to sell all they have and follow him, or to leave their families behind and follow him. Jesus is saying the priorities that you've just absorbed naturally from your society aren't necessarily the right priorities. And if you want to live an Eden lifestyle, if you want to live the way God intended you to live in the first place, you're going to need to learn new priorities. That maybe it's going to make sense for Sarah not to leave her job at Starbucks when she finishes her college diploma, because Sandra is really struggling with the aftermath of some terrible experiences she had when she was younger, and Sandra really needs Sarah to be there, standing beside her behind the counter. And that's going to mean that Sarah doesn't make as much money, which is going to make other parts of life a little bit more difficult for Sarah. But maybe following Jesus means her priorities change, and she puts being there for Sandra ahead of her own financial interests. There is a call sometimes to leave our ordinary priorities and follow Jesus and put new things ahead of them. But that doesn't mean that those are the only things that are meaningful in God's eyes. It's also meaningful when Sarah does the dishes, when Sarah goes and takes a night course and learns and uses her mind, or when she sits down on a Sunday afternoon and paints a painting because she loves art and wants to use her creativity. Those things are meaningful too. It's just that what Jesus is doing is pointing out the things that need to change rather than pointing out the things that are already meaningful and already right about a life like Sarah's. This picture begins to sound as if things like evangelism and trying to change social structures don't matter. And that's not what I'm trying to say, and I don't think that's what Paul means either. But if we are thinking that the dramatic things, the world-changing things, are the only things that God cares about, that can lead us to actually find things like evangelism and prayer and study more difficult, because it puts an incredible amount of pressure on us, right? We're not all given the same gifts. And while we are all witnesses to Jesus, man, there are some people who can just stand beside somebody on the elevator for 5 minutes and they want to come to church with them. And I am not one of those people. Sometimes I think I talk to people about Jesus and they seem less interested after they go away. And I'm not sure what I'm doing wrong. We're not all given the same gifts. And that's okay, because talking to people about Jesus isn't the only thing that matters to God, isn't the only thing that's meaningful. But interestingly, once we realize that, and once Sarah realizes that actually it's meaningful for her just to sit beside Sandra and be her friend, that changes the dynamic between those two people. And that may just actually make Sarah a better witness to Christ than if she were feeling pressured to share the gospel with her. Because then Sandra might see something in Sarah that she wants or that she's curious about. This doesn't mean that ordinary, quiet lives like Paul describes can't be part of changing the world. But for most of us, it's not a matter of us as individuals setting out to change the world and doing it all by ourselves. It's a matter of us as communities, as the people of God around the world, living often largely ordinary lives, but trying to do it according to the pattern that God created us to live in the first place, trying to do it listening to the changes in priorities that Jesus calls us to. And as we live that different kind of ordinary life, I think we may find what we've already seen in history, which is that our communities and the church at large does change the world. Not because we individually all have to do the flashy thing, but because the kind of life that God intended us for is just different enough from the life that people tend to live in the societies around us, that people will notice, and that we will be agents for change over the long run. And we will be part of changing the world because Jesus is about changing the world, not because we're ambitious enough. I would encourage you, part of what makes all of this difficult is that we're not used to thinking about God as caring about a lot of stuff in our lives. And we're used to kind of separating out the God parts of our lives from the secular parts of our lives. So I'd encourage you this week, try and find some object that reminds you of Jesus. Whether it's a pendant, whether it's a cross, whether it's a rock that you picked up on a tour of Israel sometime, whatever it is that reminds you of Jesus, and put it where you work, or put it beside the sink in your kitchen, or put it somewhere where you just do ordinary things, or put it around your neck or in your pocket. But have some object around that reminds you that Jesus is present with you even when you're doing the dishes or painting a picture or doing spreadsheets for work. Something that will remind you that that too is part of the human life that God looked at and declared very good, and that God is with you in that, and that God cares about it. And I think you may find that as we bring God mentally into those ordinary spaces in our lives, that we begin to think about those ordinary activities differently, and that changes our own world too. Amen.